Hello and welcome to another screencast, this time in the principles of training. So within this lesson, hopefully you'll understand what the key principles of training are. You'll understand what we mean by the fit principle. So you need to be able to apply both of those concepts. So the principles of training and the fit principle, and you'll need to apply that later on down the line in your coursework, your analysis of performance, but also you need to apply it to specific sports, and you need to think carefully about sort of how you can apply these specific principles. How do they actually impact, how do they improve physical fitness? So once again, in this cast, just a reminder, any yellow text boxes are for the tasks for students. Green text boxes should be note-taking sections. The blue text boxes for any differentiation tasks, and the red text boxes for teacher strategies and ideas. So quick starter for you, you might want to pause it here and just have a look at that question and maybe just write the question down and then just bullet point any answers from it. So you've been appointed as a head coach for a week. What factors do you need to think about when designing a training session for your squad? So look at those three pictures there, decide whether you're going to focus maybe on football or rugby as it is on the left hand side, or another sport of your choice. What factors do you need to think about? So just pause it there for a minute. Okay, so hopefully you've come up with a few ideas in regards to the different factors you can think about when designing a training session. So you may have included sport itself. Okay, that's important to note, because obviously when we're designing that session, if we're specifically looking at football, if we're specifically looking at rugby, then we need to ensure that we're using the right equipment for that specific sport. We might also want to be thinking about what are the components of fitness that are required to meet the demands of our performance ultimately. And are we looking at agility? Are we looking at balance? Are we looking specifically at cardiovascular fitness? So that's going to have an impact. We might also want to know the skill level of our particular group. So are they a beginner, are they an intermediate, or are they an expert? And that will have an influential decision in terms of how we design our training program. As well as that, that kind of relates a little bit maybe to the age. So age dependent, if you've got a primary school set of students, you're probably going to design your training session very differently to a professional outfit of 18-year-olds and above. The number in the group is also important as well. Do you have a limited number, so you can only do a certain amount of different exercises in the training session? Do you have a group of maybe 20, 30, whereby you need to design 2 or 3 things to keep the sports people occupied? Ultimately, the time of the season as well. So are we talking about pre-season? Are we talking about the actual season itself? Or are we talking about the off-season when we may be having a break? So those are things to consider possibly as well. The amount of space that you have available to you could have mentioned, and you could have mentioned obviously how much time we have available to us for that specific session. You could have included a lot more other things as well, so that, for example, you may have mentioned on your page about the levels of fitness, whether the athletes or the group are injured. All of those things would have been accepted, but it's just to get you to think, first of all, what things we need to consider when we're designing a training session. So we're looking at principles of training specifically, and that website link at the bottom, if you go to BBC Bitesize, and obviously for your specific exam board, if it's AQA, if it's EdXL, if it's OCR, just Google it and just watch that video. It's a really useful video in terms of training adaptations, applying the principles of training through a video as well. So it's well worth a watch, only 2 or 3 minutes long. But ultimately, for you guys, you need to be aware of what the principles of training is as a framework, and we can plan, basically we can plan a training program using these specific principles, and ultimately we use it to improve performance, to improve skill. We're looking at obviously game ability and specifically physical fitness. Again, you might want to pause the video at this stage and just think to yourself about the type of training you're currently doing in your specific sport. and how does it improve your sport? So I just want you to write down in 3 or 4 sentences what type of training you're doing and how does it improve your performance? Why are you doing the things you're doing in training? Okay, so hopefully you've answered that question. I now want you to think back at your paragraph and again, sort of just now apply these different principles. So the task asks you here, so why does our sports training need to show? Why does it need to show that we're being specific? Okay, so I just want you to think about that for a minute. Why do we need to show progressive overload? Why are we trying not to show reversibility? And also, why are we trying not to show tedium? So again, hopefully from what you've watched the BBC Bite Size video, you can remember what those keywords are. If not, come back to this task once we've gone through the definitions for each. So specificity, what is it? So it's training that should be specific to the needs of the individual and the demands on the sport. That could be through energy systems, it could be through the muscles that are being used, and through the movement patterns itself. So ultimately, again, after each of these principles, just make sure you pause it. Think of 3 examples in different sports of how we can make the sport or the training more specific. The answers here you could have come up with would be things like making the training skill specific, so that we copy, we replicate game situation. So for example, a rugby team or front row in rugby are going to be specifically looking at maybe the scrum. So they're going to be using the scrum machine because ultimately they're going to be doing that in a game situation. On top of that, we can obviously train and we can obviously train specific components of fitness that we require, and obviously use those pieces of equipment that we're going to be using for the sport. So if we're looking at football, we're going to be trying to incorporate some footballs. The same with netball or basketball, we're going to be trying to use netballs and basketballs for our session. Progressive overload, this is basically simply put, we're working harder than normal. It's a gradual improvement and a gradual process whereby we try and adapt, we try to improve, we try and increase the amount of weights that we're lifting, but we've got to do it in a gradual way. We might be increasing the intensity by running faster. So progression refers to the fact that the overload should be gradual and it increases as the body adapts. Again, pause your video here, just look at that question. If you can write down 3 clear examples of how we can show progressive overload in our training. Some answers you might want to come up with, you might have mentioned about the fact that we're going to be using heavier weights over time. We could also increase the duration, the time of training. So from instead of being at 30 minutes, we might up it to 40, 45 minutes and so on. We might increase the distance or the amount that we do in regards to our training. So instead of me running just for 1 kilometer each week, I may up that and improve my cardiovascular fitness by running the second week with 1.5 kilometers or 2 kilometers. We might also want to increase the reps, the sets, and ultimately just the amount that we do in regards to when we're lifting weights and so on. And that could be the same in regards to the intensity as well, so that we can maybe try and get a little bit quicker. We might be trying to do some of those tasks and those exercises faster as well, or we might even just increase the intensity through our effort level. So all of those things could have been implied there for the progressive overload aspect. Reversibility, this simply kind of states that an individual stops or decreases their training level, the performance and the fitness is likely to drop in this particular phase. Ultimately, we don't really want this to happen to our individual athletes. So the question now I've got there for you to pause now is just thinking about, how does a coach prevent reversibility in our players? The answer there, you could have mentioned about the fact that we have to maybe provide specific warm-ups and cool-downs. That's really important. We might also want to try and monitor fitness, fatigue levels, and that's obviously sometimes why you can see certain athletes and individuals be substituted sometimes. And as a spectator, sometimes we might curse and we might look at the TV and ask ourselves, why is the manager taking this player off or that player off? But actually they probably know their performers better than we think, and especially in regards to maybe their fitness levels or their fatigue levels, which reduces the chances of them getting injured and ultimately falling into this phase of reversibility. We also might want to monitor the technique of the performer in terms of how they lift their weights, so that they're using the correct form, so they're not going to be susceptible to chronic injuries, over repetitive injuries, and so on. Okay, so now we'll move on to tedium. So tedium basically refers to boredom. So if we do the same thing over and over and over again, ultimately our performer will become bored, probably frustrated and lacking motivation. So ultimately we need to make sure that training changes, so that we adapt our training to keep our players motivated, to keep them focused, and to ultimately keep them engaged. Another question for you to pause at this stage is, as a coach, how can we prevent tedium to our players in training? Can you give any specific examples? You might want to, at this stage, mentioned about sort of applying maybe some different fun games, making it non-repetitive, so that we're not just going for laps around the field, for example. We might want to vary some of our warm-up games, perhaps. We might want to provide some engaging and challenging tasks, make it a bit competitive. At the same time, can we, for example, improve our players' touches by playing football, tennis, for example? Quite a kind of low intensity game, but sometimes it can be engaging and fun, and that's kind of what a lot of football teams will look to do, and they might play some five-a-side matches or even three-a-side matches and so on. We might want to incorporate some music that can help with our motivation levels, and also the aspect of team bonding as well, whereby we try and incorporate different players from maybe different positions and whatever else to get to know one another and things like that. Okay, so ultimately, just with the worksheets that I've provided for you for this lesson, make sure you try to start to apply the principles of training to a marathon runner. Okay, so that's really important, and then ultimately in the lesson we'll be trying to apply some of these principles of training to some other sporting athletes. Finally then, one other principle you need to be aware of is this principle. So what we mean by that is frequency, intensity, time, and type. So in essence here, we're talking about frequency in regards to increase it. We increase the frequency by training a greater number of times a week. Okay, the amount of times that we might train increases over time, but ultimately we don't want to do too much, because we need our muscles to repair. We need to rest and recover. So frequency, although we want to increase it over time, there still needs to be periods of rest. Intensity, this, as we mentioned before, kind of really refers to increasing maybe the amount that we're lifting in terms of maybe the resistance. So this could be in weight training, and we might want to work this out again through our 1 rep max and also through our maximum heart rate. So ultimately, are we working, for example, in the aerobic zone, whereby we're looking between 60 and 80%, or are we working anaerobically for explosive power, where we're looking at 90 or 85 to 90% of our maximum? And ultimately then we've got time and type. So time obviously refers to how we might manipulate training to make it longer. We might reduce the recovery time in between certain exercises that we're doing. And all of those things can kind of copy what we might experience in a game situation where we have muscle fatigue. And then the last point about the type. So the type of training is really important, isn't it? That we not only are specific in our training, but we also match the training type to what we require from our specific sports. So there's no point, a 100-meter sprinter, Usain Bolt, training through continuous training. Ultimately, he's going to be wanting to look at interval training, HIIT training, weight training, okay, which obviously gets, up towards 80, 85, 90% of his maximum for explosive power once again, and replicating those demands for that specific sport. And then finally, sort of just from the teaching and learning point of view, this is specifically for teachers. So a couple of things that I would do here. The bottom one is this idea of broadcast it. So you could get students to work in pairs. They've got a minute to maybe come up with a video conference call whereby they have to explain the principles of training to a specific sports person that could be chosen from their partner. And then also looking at this idea of getting pictures scattered around the room, And with different post-it notes, for example, you could get the students to apply the principles of training, and that's quite an enjoyable task as well. Good luck, folks.